Hey guys, so here we are back at it. We're going to be talking about bipolar and depressive disorders today. We are also going to be talking about suicide and interventions relating to that feature. So just a heads up that all of that stuff is on the docket for today. So the first thing to realize about the mood disorders is that they are based in our body's completely natural, normal emotions. More specifically, the two that relate to our content today are going to be joy and then sadness on the opposite end of the spectrum. We already talked about this in class, so I'm not going to go through the slide in detail, but in a nutshell, just know that all of our emotions are completely normal, completely natural. None of them, not even the ones that are less pleasant, are diseased or disordered by nature. All of our emotions are adaptive. And ultimately, the reason that we're diagnosing these disorders has nothing to do with a particular emotion being bad or good or not, but the fact that these normal, natural emotional states have begun to interfere with daily life, becoming distressing or impairing in one way or another. The cornerstone of our diagnoses for today are going to be our mood episodes. The first one that is relevant to you guys is the major depressive episode, which is also something that we reviewed in class. So again, I'm not going to go into this slide in a ton of detail. Just know that in order to diagnose an MDE, you need to see 5 or more of these 9 symptoms over at least a 2-week period of time. And then at least one of those symptoms must be a critical symptom, either dysphoria or anhedonia. And that in children and adolescents, there is a bit of a developmental trajectory in that we are looking for more kind of irritability versus sadness for that dysphoria symptom. So, major depressive disorder, how do we diagnose it? Well, once you know what an MDE is, it's relatively easy to diagnose MDD, which again is what you would actually be diagnosing a patient with. Major depressive episodes, much like panic attacks or obsessions or compulsions, are not something you would diagnose kind of on their own. Rather, they're building blocks towards diagnoses themselves. So the first thing that we need is at least one major depressive episode causing distress or impairment. Then we want to rule out other causes, including substances, medical conditions, and mental disorders, particularly psychotic disorders. We also want to make sure that there's absolutely no history of mania or hypomania. The reason for this is that the depressive disorders are, to a degree, unipolar depressive disorders. So you'll see once we get into the bipolar disorders that what we mean there is we're talking about emotional states on both ends of an emotional spectrum. So we're dealing with both highs and lows. But with the depressive disorders or unipolar depressive disorders, we're dealing with exclusively low mood, which is why we need to make sure there's absolutely no history of mania or hypomania. If we do uncover a history there, then we'd want to switch gears to evaluating this person for the bipolar disorders rather than the depressive disorders. If, however, the person's mania or hypomania was induced due to a substance or medical condition. For instance, if the patient were prescribed an antidepressant, and that's what kind of catalyzed a past episode of, let's say, hypomania, we wouldn't necessarily count that because there is an alternative reason for that episode versus that episode occurring naturally. So what we're really trying to rule out here are naturally occurring manic or hypomanic episodes. Here, I would encourage you guys to pause the video and watch this YouTube clip about a woman named Allison. She does a wonderful job of highlighting really severe major depression. I want to point that out. She has really all 9 of these symptoms. She also talks about a past suicide attempt. So she is a great example of what we would call severe MDD. She's definitely not representative of everyone with MDD, but one of the reasons that I like this video is because you kind of get a glimpse at what each symptom looks like. She also is kind of actively presenting as depressed. So you also get a feel for what depression looks like, what it feels like, at least the more severe forms when you're working with it in session. As far as additional features go, symptoms must be present nearly every day, with the exception of some things that, practically speaking, you wouldn't really see them every day. So things like weight change, a person doesn't have to be continually losing or gaining weight each and every day. Weight just doesn't work that way. Typically, people will lose or gain weight in a less linear fashion. Similarly, in order to have insomnia or hypersomnia, a person need not have those every single night, maybe just most nights out of the week. Suicidal ideation may be another symptom that fluctuates somewhat. But if we are talking about something like difficulty concentrating or fatigue or sadness or anhedonia, those are symptoms that are common to see nearly every day. And in order to count a symptom towards a major depressive episode to kind of reach that total that we're looking for of 5 symptoms, a symptom must newly be present, meaning that if a person has a history of difficulty concentrating, perhaps associated with chronic stress, perhaps associated with undiagnosed ADHD, we would not diagnose that chronic difficulty concentrating towards our total of 5. We're looking for the onset of an episode, meaning the onset of new symptoms. Fatigue and insomnia are the most common presenting complaints present in a really high number of cases. The prevalence of MDD is about 7% of adults, and the rate of diagnosis is 3 times higher in 18 to 29-year-olds as well as females. So those are going to be some of our higher risk groups. Most folks with MDD do recover within 3 to 12 months, and chronic presentations are more likely to be associated with substance use, personality disorders, anxiety, and also have a decreased likelihood of full remission. So it's most likely that if someone is going to recover, they're going to recover in about a year. If we're seeing symptoms last longer than a year, we might be dealing with more of a chronic presentation, which will relate to one of the diagnoses that we'll talk about later, persistent depressive disorder. We may diagnose a person with a seasonal pattern specifier, which is likely something you guys, you might not be familiar with the name, but you're likely familiar with the presentation. It sometimes is referred to as seasonal affect disorder. That might be the term that you're more familiar with, but the clinical diagnosis would be major depressive disorder with seasonal pattern specifier. And we would diagnose this if the person was experiencing recurrent major depressive disorder, which means we're dealing with recurrent episodes associated with seasonal change. Most commonly, the seasons that we'll see impacted are winter and actually spring. Winter has a lot to do with the temperature, getting colder, forcing people inside, less access to nature, less access to people in order to socialize. Less access to sun and vitamin D. Those things can all contribute to this seasonal pattern. Alternatively, we also see spring presentations relatively often, and a lot of this has to do with allergies. More recent data is suggesting that depression may actually be an inflammatory disease. And so when people have allergies, also an inflammatory disease, some more recent hypotheses are suggesting that these two things may kind of co-occur and that allergies can increase the risk of developing a major depressive episode. So winter and spring are the 2 seasons that we see the most. And again, if a person is developing these major depressive episodes each year at about the same time, that would be an appropriate time to add in the specifier with seasonal pattern. I do want to touch on grief. We had talked about this briefly in class, identifying basically that a person can be diagnosed with a major depressive episode while actively grieving. This is something that we could not previously diagnose in earlier editions of the DSM, not until at least the person had been grieving for a certain amount of time. Now we can diagnose MDEs sooner and during the process of grief. But we are advised to only diagnose major depressive disorder if the episode present is judged to be beyond the normal response we would expect to significant loss. If the person is simply grieving and not experiencing a major depressive episode in kind of the process of their grief, we might diagnose them with something called uncomplicated bereavement. It's a sociocultural code, it's not clinical, and it's basically just indicating on the patient's file that they're grieving. It's normal grief, it's painful, it's definitely worth treating, but it's not major depressive disorder. So let's take a moment and kind of look at the differences between uncomplicated bereavement or normal grief and something that would be more clinical, warranting potentially a major depressive disorder diagnosis. So with grief, it's normal to feel empty, a sense of loss. With the major depressive episode, though, we're shifting more towards those critical symptoms of dysphoria and anhedonia. With grief, intensity typically decreases over time, and the emotions will come in cued waves. So a person might feel a wave of emotion at a memorial or a funeral service, or at the weekly or monthly anniversaries of the person's passing, or when doing an activity or eating a meal or telling stories or something that's kind of reminding the person of the individual who had passed. Versus, as we've already established with the major depressive disorders, we're dealing with persistent symptoms more days than not, nearly every day. And the symptoms are also uncued. So we're kind of dealing with this constant versus these waves of emotions. With grief, we might also see positive emotions. That's one of the, in my opinion, one of the easiest ways to kind of tell the difference, is that a person who's grieving may alternate between sadness and then maybe also laughing or expressing joy at a more pleasant memory of the person, versus with the MDE, we're more likely to see not only these consistently negative symptoms, but a lack of positive emotions as well. With grief, the person's thoughts are typically focused on the deceased, versus with the major depressive episode, thoughts may turn more inward and become a bit more self-critical or pessimistic, like wondering what one has done with their life at this point. And so the focus becomes more on the individual who is grieving versus the focus being on the deceased. With grief, we are more likely to see self-esteem remain intact, versus, as the previous differentiating factor indicated with the MDE, we're more likely to see worthlessness, self-loathing, again, a little bit more of an inward focus with the MDE. With grief, if we do see suicidal symptoms, which we don't always see, the thoughts are more likely to be associated with joining the deceased, versus if we're seeing suicidality, which again, we don't always see with the major depressive episode, it's more associated with personally feeling worthless, personally wanting to escape pain and where one is right now, versus wanting to join with the person who has passed. Okay, so moving on to diagnosis number 2. This is the more chronic version that I had mentioned earlier, something that you might want to start considering if a person hasn't recovered in a year or two, depending on the person's age. So the first criteria that we're going to be dealing with here is a depressed mood most of the day, more days than not, for 2 years if we're dealing with an adult. If we're dealing with a child or a teenager, we're looking for 1 or more years. And again, that mood may be more irritable than it is sad. In addition, we want to be observing 2 or more symptoms, which include a number of symptoms that are associated with the major depressive episode, although this is a distinct and different list. We may see poor appetite or overeating, so that's a familiar symptom, as is insomnia or hypersomnia. We may also see fatigue or poor concentration, also familiar symptoms. The 2 new symptoms here are low self-esteem and hopelessness. So again, we need to be observing at least 2 of these 6 in addition to that core symptom of depressed mood or irritability, again, depending on the person's age. The person has ultimately never been without symptoms for 2 or more months in a 2-year period of time. So if we're dealing with 4 years or 6 years, then we're dealing with 4 months or 6 months that the person could potentially have been symptom-free over that period of time. This doesn't have to be a consecutive 2 months. It could be a month here, 2 weeks here, another 2 weeks there. But for the most part, the vast majority of the time that this person has spent over however long a period of time this is, 2+ years, 1+ years. If there were times when the person wasn't depressed or irritated, it's not a ton of time. Major depressive disorder may be continuously present over that period of time. So the person might be meeting criteria for both dysthymia and MDD. If this is the case, we sometimes refer to it colloquially as double depression. But again, we're making sure to rule out any history of mania, hypomania, or cyclothymia, which is a bipolar version of dysthymia. Because again, we're dealing with unipolar depression here. We're not dealing with anything on the other end of the spectrum. We again want to make sure that we're ruling out other mental disorders, particularly psychotic disorders, as the mood disorders can become psychotic in their more severe forms. We also want to rule out substances or medical conditions that could be causing these diagnoses as well, and ensure that the person is significantly distressed or impaired. As far as features go, the first piece I want to introduce you guys to are some specifiers. As I mentioned earlier, it is possible to meet criteria for both dysthymia and major depressive disorder at the same time. While colloquially we'll sometimes refer to this as a double depression, clinically and officially there are several specifiers that we actually use to label the patient's file. So if a person meets criteria for dysthymia and there is absolutely no major depressive episode present, we would clarify or specify that they have pure dysthymic syndromes. That's the specifier we would kind of add in there. If there is a persistent major depressive episode, a long one that's kind of existing during the same time span as the dysthymia, we might include the specifier with persistent major depressive episode. And if we have major depressive episodes that come and go, we might specify with intermittent major depressive episodes. And ultimately, you can see what that looks like to a degree on this chart on the far side of the screen. So for folks with major depressive disorder, they may have a normal mood kind of at their base. And then over time, they'll develop one or more major depressive episodes where their mood dips down really low. But for someone with dysthymia who has major depressive episodes, their mood is chronically dysthymic. So they chronically have that low mood accompanied with at least 2 symptoms. But then periodically they'll develop, at least 2 to 3 additional symptoms to kind of pull them down into that majorly depressed space. And then in terms of recovery, they are likely to only recover to that previously established dysthymic level rather than recovering fully to a normal, healthy mood. The prevalence of dysthymia is about 1 to 2% of adults. It often onsets early, ranging from childhood to early adulthood, and obviously, as the name suggests, it's chronic versus something that is more acute. Early onset, so developing dysthymia prior to the age of 21, is associated with personality as well as substance use disorders. So it's more likely that to a degree this person's mood may more so be a consequence of their personality versus a consequence of what's happening around them. So we might be seeing kind of a neurotic personality here. And then the substance use has more to do with kind of coping mechanisms. If symptoms do rise to major depressive episode level, as I mentioned before, they'll often return to that previously dysthymic level. And also, as mentioned before, major depressive episodes are oftentimes discovered when dysthymia is diagnosed. And frequently, major depressive episodes can be the reason that the person reports to therapy in the first place. Dysthymia can feel like, okay, well, this is just life. It's not pleasant. It sucks, but I've just kind of been this way for a while and it's only a couple of symptoms, it's manageable, but then a person may develop a major depressive episode, things suddenly feel worse, and oftentimes that's kind of when the person will present for treatment. So it's not completely uncommon to discover major depressive episodes for a dysthymic patient once they have reported for therapy. Okay. So I did want to focus a little bit on females in depression because, as I mentioned earlier, we do see significantly more diagnoses among females as males, about twice as many diagnoses. And we see this across cultures. And what's interesting is that the sex difference really only emerges once puberty has happened. So after about the age of 10, suggesting, you know, are female hormones playing a role? Is it more social? Does it have to do with how our society treats women once they kind of become women versus how they treat girls pre-puberty? So a lot of different hypotheses at play. But interestingly enough, the DSM does have several different diagnoses or specifiers that do describe specifically female presentations relating to depression. So I did want to spend a little bit of time kind of briefly educating on what those are and the differences between the diagnoses and normal natural presentations. So one such diagnosis is actually premenstrual dysphoric disorder, or PMDD. This would be diagnosed if a woman were experiencing consistent mood, sleep, appetite, and libido changes associated with her monthly menstrual cycle. The prevalence of this is about 1 to 5% of reproductive females, and this is not simply PMS, premenstrual syndrome. This is something clinical, as the name suggests. It's a dysphoric disorder, it's a mood disorder, so the impairment has to be significant, and the symptoms impairing for this diagnosis to be warranted. Another diagnosis that we'll see exclusively impacting, or not exclusively, predominantly impacting females, is major depressive disorder with a peripartum onset. So peripartum onset is an additional specifier that we could add to a major depressive disorder diagnosis. What this means is that a person is experiencing a major depressive episode relating to birth. So partum means birth and peri means around. So a person could actually be diagnosed with this during pregnancy, and about 50% of cases occur during pregnancy, but the person could also be diagnosed postpartum as well. So more commonly, you'll hear this referred to as postpartum depression, but again, that name's a bit of a misnomer because this can happen during pregnancy. And again, clinically, how we would diagnose it is major depressive disorder with peripartum onset. This can also be diagnosed in fathers and adoptive parents as well. So being a birth parent is not a necessity, although that's definitely the population that we do see this diagnosed the most among. In order to diagnose this, we're basically looking for the presence of a major depressive episode during pregnancy or within the month following a birth. Additional symptoms that we may see include feeling overwhelmed, feeling empty, disconnected, or guilty. For the birth parent, this can be linked with hormone withdrawal. Pregnant women have really high levels of estrogen, oxytocin, and once the birth is over, those hormone levels start to change, and so hormone withdrawal can be a reason for part of this. And additional reasons that we might see this diagnosis include other precipitating factors like a difficult or traumatic birth. Again, I do want to point out that this is not something called the baby blues. The baby blues is somewhat sad or depressive symptoms that exist during the first 2 weeks following a birth. They are exclusively linked to hormones, and so they naturally get better after 2 weeks. But if we're seeing this episode during pregnancy, prior to that hormone withdrawal, or lasting much longer than those 2 weeks, or even kind of occurring more than 2 weeks out from the birth, that's really where we would be in major depressive disorder territory. So this isn't kind of that very normal, exclusively hormone withdrawal that we do see in a lot of birth parents. This is much more expansive, and at its core is really kind of the presence of a major depressive episode during a period in this person's life. And again, we predominantly do diagnose this in birth parents, but I again just want to throw this out there that fathers and all kinds of parents, adoptive parents, can be diagnosed with this as well. Okay. So switching gears towards suicide. So this is going to be our bridge topic leading into our bipolar disorders. I do want to point out that not all suicidal behaviors and thoughts are related to depression. There are, in fact, a huge variety of disorders within the DSM that are associated with suicide. And in fact, if you guys kind of look further down on the screen, you'll see that one of the top risks for suicidal thoughts and behaviors is mental illness. About 90% of folks who make a suicide attempt have something diagnosable within the DSM. And in fact, one of the reasons I introduced the topic here in between depression and the bipolar disorders is because you will see it kind of as a feature across both. So not all of it is related to depression. I feel like that's a bit of a misnomer or misconception. So just want to kind of throw that out there. It's the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, and it accounts for 50% of violent deaths worldwide, the other 50% coming from accidents. There are several stages of suicidal thoughts and behaviors, the first of which is ideation, which would be the major depressive symptom that we talked about earlier. Ideation is simply thoughts relating to suicide. They are not automatically linked to urges or behaviors. And in fact, thoughts themselves can be passive or active in nature. Passive suicidal ideation is someone who is maybe contemplating about what it would be like to die. There might be some curiosity mixed in there. A person may be wondering what it would be like to be at their own funeral, or what it would be like to hit the pause button, what it would be like to fall asleep and never wake up. Passive suicidal ideation might also take the form of what it would be like for death to come to them. So just to die now, in the near future, in the distant future, versus what it would be like to actively take one's own life. Active suicidal ideation is a bit more purposeful. It's where a person is thinking about what it would be like to die by suicide. So not what it would be like to fall asleep and not wake up, or get hit by a car, but what it would be like to take one's own life. Parasuicide is a shift towards suicidal behaviors, and it's closely related to the suicide attempt. Really, the two are very much the same thing. The only real difference between a parasuicide and a suicide attempt is the lethality of the method that the person has chosen. Parasuicides have a very, 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 very low likelihood of being fatal, and are more often conceptualized as a cry for help. For example, I worked briefly in a high school after graduating from graduate school, and some examples of things that students would bring into my office were, expressing that they had a seafood allergy, even though the documentation around such an allergy was inconsistent, and saying that they had some popcorn shrimp at lunch. Or I had another student come in who was kind of scratching at themselves really persistently with a mechanical pencil and had definitely harmed themselves and caused some damage. But neither of those things had really any likelihood of lethality. It would have been a different story if we were dealing with more of an established allergy in the one case. But they were both conceptualized by the students as suicide attempts. So there was a very serious cognitive component to the behaviors, but practically speaking, there was a really low fatality rate associated with both of those. And so those are really more cries for help. And what I always like to tell people about parasuicides is that they should not be shrugged off just because the likelihood of death was extremely low. They should instead be taken very seriously. And in a way, they're kind of a good thing because they're indicating that the person is wanting help. And then on some level, they're not really wanting to die. Otherwise, they would have chosen a different method. Instead, they're wanting to get your attention and again, wanting to get help. An attempt is something that carries a higher likelihood of a fatality, something that could have caused death, but didn't. The person survived. And then a completed suicide or a death would be when someone ended up dying by suicide. Risks for suicide, as I mentioned before, include mental illness. It's also more prevalent in the young and the old. So those 15 to 29 are at a higher risk, and older adults, those 65 and older, are at a higher risk. The age group that dies most often by suicide is actually older adults. But because of the huge number of chronic diseases that also impact that population, suicide is not a leading cause of death for that group. But that is the group who dies most often by suicide. For the young, for teenagers and emerging young adults, suicide is a leading cause of death. Males also are more likely to die by suicide. And a lot of this simply has to do with a preference for means. Males are more likely to choose more fatal methods like a firearm, which carries an 85 to 90% fatality rate. Versus females are more likely to choose cutting or poisoning methods, which only carries a 2% likelihood of fatality. And so by and large, one of the big reasons that males die more often has to do with the choice of means, which will lead us into a really easy, straightforward intervention that we'll talk about in the next slide. Previous attempts is also going to be a huge risk factor. It's probably the strongest risk factor that we have. Someone who has survived a previous attempt has a 30 to 40% increased risk of dying by suicide compared with someone who has not made a previous attempt. That being said, though, the vast majority of people who survive an attempt do not go on to die by suicide. So I always like to point that out, that while this is a leading risk factor, it's not a death sentence. Most people who survive an attempt do not go on to die by suicide. We may also see clusters of suicides that can pose as kind of like a social type of risk. So socially, sometimes we'll see suicides clustered within communities, and these can be kind of geographic communities where you'll see multiple deaths within a community. One person dies and that death isn't covered well, or it ends up triggering other folks who then end up dying later on. With the advent of technology, sometimes you'll see similar social clusters, but existing within kind of online groups versus geographically proximal groups. Sometimes you'll see suicides cluster in families as well for both social and biological or genetic reasons. The Van Gogh and the Hemingway families are two examples of familial clusters. In terms of prevention, the number one resource that I always like to inform folks about, and the one that I lean back on as kind of my first line of defense within practice, is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. This is a really great resource because it's nationally available. It's not something that's exclusively available in urban, areas. You can reach it nationwide in all 50 states. And by calling or even texting their text line, which is a newer resource, you'll be connected with a trained crisis counselor. So this isn't just a volunteer. This is someone who knows what they're talking about and is educated regarding suicide and kind of preliminary interventions. This crisis counselor also is well informed regarding local resources, and so they can help connect you to a more permanent provider near you, because this is not, teletherapy. This is de-escalating crisis and referring to a person to a more consistent form of help. And so even if you're connected with a crisis counselor in like Charlotte, for instance, you would be referred to local resources in the high country versus only given resources in more dense kind of urban city centers. They are also able to send help immediately. So if we are truly in the midst of a crisis and somebody has made an attempt or engaged in some type of behavior, these individuals are trained to call and send 911 if needed. The line is completely anonymous as well. So it's not something that is going to result in, whatever it is you talk about being reported to anybody, unless of course you are sharing that you or someone else is in imminent danger, as in a crisis where again an ambulance might be sent. It's also a good resource for concerned loved ones as well. I always like to point that out, that this isn't exclusively for folks who are actively suicidal. You guys at this point should have done the online suicide gatekeeper training, either the one through app or the one through QPR. And, if you were to have to use either of those methods in the next year or so, that information might be really fresh on your mind. Or, I know that the apps training really kind of hinges pretty strongly on ASU resources. But if you were worried about someone as far as suicide goes, 5-10 years from now, and you couldn't quite remember that training, or the resources you got in that training aren't really relevant anymore, you can absolutely call this number or text as a concerned individual, someone who's concerned for a loved one, and ask about local resources and use those referrals to intervene with the person who's being impacted. Some other kind of higher level interventions that really can be utilized by professionals and lay folks to a degree are things like supervision and means restriction. And those are some of the reasons why I like to review these interventions in particular, is because they're not more complicated interventions that would require graduate level training. They're fairly simple, straightforward interventions that, again, you could really utilize as a parent, a concerned loved one. They're also things you can advocate for as a professional if you do end up pursuing therapy as a career. So the first intervention is simply to provide supervision and support, which again is something you can do as a parent, concerned loved one, or something you can advise as a professional. The reason that supervision is important is because when a person feels that suicidal urge come on, if the person is going to make an attempt, most often they will do so within 10 minutes of that urge coming on. And that's because urges are very wave-like. They're intense and they're big, but they also come and go relatively quickly. And so typically, if you can just kind of keep eyes on a person and get them through those 10 minutes, that's not to say that they're going to be feeling great once those 10 minutes lapse. But the intensity of the urge and the emotion is going to dissipate, and the likelihood of the person engaging in a behavior, making an attempt, goes down dramatically. And you can see that represented in this graphic on the left-hand side of the screen. So as far as, parents or roommates are concerned, this is something really easy and straightforward that you can implement. And again, it's something you can advise as a professional as well. Again, it's not a cure-all. It's not going to magically make the emotional distress underlying the suicidal ideation and urges go away, but it is kind of a life-saving, simply put, a life-saving intervention. Also a life-saving intervention that is aimed exclusively at just that, more so than improving the underlying causes of the suicidality, is going to be means restriction. And the basis for this intervention comes from what we talked about earlier, the fact that means matter. The main reason that males die more often of suicide compared to females has to do with the means that males choose over females. They choose things that are very likely to kill them versus females typically choose less fatal means. And so again, simply by just paying attention to fatal means and limiting access to them, we can, again, keep people alive. And the data supporting this particular approach comes to us from community level data exploring suicide rates in high versus low gun states, guns being a high fatality method. So this one study that was published in 2013 with data coming from about 4 to 5 years prior, divided up not all of the United States, but several of them into two groups. And the states that were chosen on the basis of whether or not they were high or low gun states. High gun states were states in which 50% of the households in the state owned firearms, and low gun states were states in which only 15% of households owned firearms. And then also states were chosen such that the total number of people living in the two groups of states were even. So we kind of had an even sampling across the two groups. So we had a population of about 31.5 million people in each of the groupings. And so simply what the researchers did is they tracked suicides. So we saw that firearm suicides, unsurprisingly, was much higher in the high gun states, about 7,500 people compared to about 1,700 people. The non-firearm suicides, however, is really where the data gets interesting. And as you guys can see, those numbers are pretty dead even at about 4,300 in each grouping of states. So it's not like people were finding other ways to attempt suicide. When you simply remove highly fatal means, people die less often. And so again, this is a life-saving, life-promoting approach. And so overall, if you look at total suicide numbers, you'll see that about twice the number of people are dying by suicide in high gun states, about 12,000 compared to about 6,000. You'll also see that you can also see the number of attempts reflected in that graphic as well. And so means restriction is, again, something you can do as a parent, as a loved one. It's also something you can advise as a professional as well. The means that I will typically focus on if I'm working with someone are firearms and medications. Firearms, I suggest getting them completely out of the house, and this includes bedside firearms as well. Just completely removing them from the environment. You can give them to a trusted friend or family member to hang on to until the individual in question is feeling better. You can actually also temporarily turn firearms into police stations for safekeeping. It's not a permanent surrender. It's just kind of, these aren't safe to be in the house right now. And your local police station will hold them for you until you're ready to come and get them again. As far as medications go, the first line of defense is to kind of go through medicine cabinets and get rid of any prescription drugs that have expired or that aren't in use anymore. You do not want to throw them out or flush them down the toilet, though, as the medications will get into the ground soil and groundwater that way. Instead, what you want to do is you want to return them to drugstores. Oftentimes, pharmacies will always accept old medication back. You can also turn old medications into police stations. And then for any medications that are necessary to keep in the house, you might consider a lockbox. And then finally, we touched on this in going over sensitive language. But the final topic that I want to touch on relating to suicide is the idea of social contagion and how we talk about suicide after one has occurred to prevent that social type of clustering that we talked about earlier. Copycat suicides can result from community suicides, which include things like celebrity suicides, media coverage of suicide details, portrayals of the deceased as a martyr or tragic, flawed hero, can encourage folks who are feeling similarly to go with an urge in the hopes of being portrayed similarly. And as I mentioned in that lecture on language, there was about a 30% increase in the youth suicide rate a month after the debut of the first season of 13 Reasons Why. So that's always kind of a data point that I use to highlight how inappropriate, overly detailed, overly graphic information around suicide, while attempting to be informative in this case, can really be very triggering to people who are currently kind of in that negative headspace. Solutions include things like critical incident debriefing. This is something that's typically done in schools or other impacted areas by trained professionals. And then something that we can all do is just be more sensitive in terms of how we cover and speak about suicide-related deaths, being cognizant of those who are around us and the things going on with them that we may not be aware of. And of course, every single time that you talk about suicide in a more public forum, you want to make sure that you're including the contact information for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Final little intervention piece is, as I mentioned earlier, everybody should be doing one of these two forms of training, either QPR or APPS. I won't really go into detail regarding these approaches here because you guys are going through the training, so I don't feel the need to reiterate it. In a nutshell, these are really kind of the same approaches. One is more of a national certification, and the other is ASCU's version that has kind of reworked the stages to be a little cutesy and relevant to app. And the resources for both of those are available on As You Learn and on the slide here. In a nutshell, the approach basically takes the form of confidently asking the individual about whether or not they are thinking about suicide or thinking about killing themselves, being direct in the question versus beating around the bush, allowing space for the person to talk about what's going on, and then sharing referrals. This should be a private conversation versus public, obviously. You also should not go into this conversation with a time crunch. So this isn't something you should try to squeeze into the hour you have between classes. This should be something where, if this takes 5 hours, you theoretically have 5 hours. And you should go into the conversation with referrals ready to give to the person, preparing to sit there and maybe even call referrals with the person or go with the person to an appointment can be helpful as well. When I'm teaching this class in person, I also like to have the class practice direct questioning. In my personal experience, saying these things out loud, like, are you thinking about killing yourself? Are you thinking about suicide? And just kind of having practice saying these scary questions aloud makes it a little bit easier when you have to ask this question. Either of a friend or a family member or in a professional setting, it makes the conversation a little bit less intimidating. So I always advise, if not now, then definitely before heading into one of those conversations down the line, I would advise kind of practicing what it is you're going to say. And then finally, I always like to review the university's Counseling and Psychological Services Center as the prime, referral source that you guys would be using right now as students. It's located on the first floor of Miles Anna's building, which is the same building that houses health services and the post office. I've listed their phone number on the screen as well as their hours of operation. 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. They have initial consultation hours, which for the most part is that entire time minus kind of the first 30 minutes to an hour and the last 30 minutes to an hour of each day, and then a lunch hour in the middle. Ultimately, though, if you came into the counseling center in an acute crisis, even if it was outside of those hours, they would find someone to speak with you. If, however, you're coming in not with a crisis, meaning you're not actively suicidal, we're not dealing with active trauma or sexual assault, the folks there will refer you to the established consult hours. So if you were going in with like a panic attack, for instance, they would encourage you to stick with the initial consult hours. But if you were going in with suicide, they would basically see you anytime within that 8 to 5 window. If it's after hours, you can call the same number, and instead of being directed to the open office, you'll be directed to an on-call counselor. This is just to provide after hours emergency coverage. Emergencies being defined as urgent mental health concerns that can't wait, things like suicidal thoughts, sexual assault, and trauma. And if the emergency is acute, meaning that someone has like made an attempt and we're dealing with imminent danger, physical injury, 911 is always the appropriate number to call in that scenario, regardless of where you are. Okay, last chunk of an admittedly long lecture. This is definitely the longest one of the semester. So moving on to the bipolar disorders. Again, I'm not going to go over mania and hypomania in detail as we already did that in class. Just know that these are the 2 episodes that relate to the bipolar disorders. Here we're dealing with 3 or more symptoms, 4 or more if the base mood is irritable over a 1-week period of time, including significant distress and impairment, and making sure that we are ruling out other causes. Hypomania is the same symptom count, except we're dealing with 4 or more days in terms of duration and no significant impairment. So let's take the episodes down. Again, the disorders are pretty easy. Bipolar 1 disorder is 1 or more manic episodes and ruling out other mental disorders, particularly psychotic disorders. So you might be wondering, why only mania? I thought bipolar was both ends of the spectrum, so why aren't we talking about depression? The reason is because of the 3 episodes, mania is probably the most severe. It's the one that is most likely to cause problems for the individual. And so from a diagnostic point of view, if we see mania, we want to be able to diagnose and move ahead with treatment versus waiting for the presence of other episodes. And in reality, people with bipolar 1 oftentimes have major depressive and or hypomanic episodes as well, but they're not necessary for the diagnosis. And again, just as I shared with you guys the video of Allison earlier, this one about John is made by the same people. And again, this is a severe case. He has basically all of the symptoms of mania. He also is demonstrating psychosis and is in a hospital. So he is a good example of a severe presentation. So it's important to recognize that not all presentations match John's, but again, I like John's for the same reason I like Allison's, in that it's a good example of really all of the symptoms. Bipolar 2 is kind of a milder form of bipolar 1. Here we're looking for 1 hypomanic episode, 1 major depressive episode, and there has never been a history of mania. If the person develops mania down the line, the diagnosis would change to bipolar 1. So that's a pretty easy thing to remember, is mania basically equals bipolar 1 and bipolar 1 equals mania. So if you see mania, you know what your diagnosis is. You don't really need to go any further. And again, ruling out other causes, particularly psychosis, especially if you are dealing with more intense forms of impairment, you want to make sure that you're ruling out psychosis as an alternative cause. As far as features go, irritability is more likely to be the predominant mood if the individual's wishes have been denied or the individual's using substances. So if we go back to look at the episode, you'll see that we have a variety of base moods that a person could present with. So the person's more likely to be irritable if they're wanting to spend a bunch of money and you're not letting them, or someone dropped them off at the hospital and they're wanting to leave, but it's not safe for us to allow them to leave. So if their wishes are being denied, they're more likely to be irritable. Irritability may also be more commonly associated with substance use as well. Goal-directed activity and a decreased need for sleep are the most common symptoms. Activity is typically associated with little knowledge of the topic, but it's nothing, most commonly, it's nothing outside of the individual's reach. It might not really make sense what the person's doing, as you guys either saw or will see in watching John's video. But the activity at least is feasible, even if the outcome is unlikely to be good. So basically what this means is that goal-directed activity doesn't have to be oriented towards something that the person is an expert in. And most likely it's the person picking up something random and kind of throwing themselves into that. We may see increased self-esteem associated with the goal-directed activity. We also may see increased sociability, even if it's inappropriate. So this might include becoming increasingly sexually suggestive or something like that. The bipolar disorders are less common than the depressive disorders, impacting about 1% of the population with an even sex ratio. The common age of onset is 18 years old, and the number of lifetime episodes is actually highest for bipolar 2. So while bipolar 2 is milder, you're more likely to see more episodes in those cases. Low insight's pretty common. So we kind of covered the topic of insight in talking about the obsessive compulsive related disorders. And so this is another one where the person is less likely to fully grasp the reality of what's going on. They're really viewing what's going on with them as normal, nothing wrong. We would diagnose a rapid cycling specifier if the person was experiencing 4 episodes per year. And this is associated with the poorest course and the poorest outcomes. I always like to point out this specifier because, as we talked about in the sensitive language PowerPoint, the term bipolar is frequently used colloquially to refer to anything that's kind of up and down or all over the place. Like the weather is so bipolar because it was sunny in the morning and now it's raining in the afternoon, you know, a change over the course of hours. In reality, bipolar disorders are actually pretty slow. 4 episodes a year is considered a lot. And a person is typically not shifting immediately from one episode to the next, but may be experiencing some normal mood in the middle. So the person isn't constantly either up or down. There's plenty of normal mood in the middle. And as I mentioned earlier, not all suicide is associated with depression, and the bipolar disorders collectively carry a 15 times higher risk of suicide compared to the regular population. Cyclothymic disorder, or cyclothymia, is basically the bipolar version of dysthymia. And like dysthymia, it is a milder but more chronic version of the bipolar disorders. So here we're looking for, again, 2 years worth of symptoms for an adult, 1 year worth of symptoms for a child or teenager. We don't have a specific list of symptoms here, though. The DSM simply tells us to reference the list of symptoms for hypomania and the list of symptoms for depression. And we're just looking for sub-threshold symptoms, meaning that the person isn't crossing that 3 or 4 symptom mark for hypomania, and they aren't crossing the 5 symptom mark for depression. So sub-threshold hypomania and depression. Symptoms have been present for at least half of the time, and the individual has not been symptom-free for 2 or more months. So What this means is similar to dysthymia. The person's not completely symptom-free for more than 2 months, but then within a 2-year period of time. So if we're dealing with 4 years, we're dealing with 4 months, and so on and so forth. But then within that more chronic period of time, an individual's symptom may kind of come and go to a degree. But if we're kind of taking track of history and collective symptoms and how long symptoms have been there, if a person's having difficulty concentrating, that symptom has been present at least half of the time during the duration of this diagnosis. And that if the person is experiencing a decreased need for sleep, that's been present at least half of the time for the duration of the diagnosis. And that collectively, these puzzle pieces kind of fit on top of each other such that the person hasn't been completely symptom-free for more than 2 months in a 2-year period of time. We're ruling out the presence of any mood-based episode. So if the person is ever meeting criteria for a mood episode, at that point we would change the diagnosis to whichever of the kind of full-formed episodic diagnoses best describes the individual's presentation. So if we see a major depressive episode, the diagnosis would then change to a major depressive disorder. We want to rule out psychotic disorders, as well as other potential causes, including substances and medical conditions, and ensure that distress and impairment is present. Features include a chronic fluctuating mood, involving symptoms at both poles. So we're dealing with highs and lows, but ultimately never meeting criteria for an episode. The prevalence is about 3 to 5% of adults, so more than the bipolar disorders. The onset is similar, and sex ratios are similar for the bipolar disorders as well. And about 15 to 50% of individuals eventually end up developing bipolar disorder. So this can be a stepping stone for some. For others, they just kind of continue to have a cyclothymic diagnosis. And then finally, I always like to include a visual review at the end of this chapter, just because that was one of the things that helped me out the most when I was learning about these, is because we are dealing with a spectrum here, high and low mood. You can kind of graph out what these different diagnoses look like, and as a more visual person, that kind of helped me grasp the differences. So I always like to introduce a similar chart just to kind of show what these different mood states look like and how you could theoretically chart any patient's mood on a chart like this. So euthymia, or normal healthy mood, would be everything in the middle. Mania would be the highest high, depression the lowest low. Hypomania would be somewhere between euthymia and mania, and then dysthymia would be somewhere between euthymia and low depression. And depending on what a person was presenting with, we would kind of chart that out and we could see what their diagnosis was. Major depression would be someone who exclusively experienced euthymia and then periodically went down to depression. Persistent depression is someone who would consistently be at that dysthymic subsyndromal depression level. A bipolar 1 would be really anything as long as mania was included. Bipolar 2 would include some hypomania, some depression, but no mania. And cyclothymia would be someone who's kind of like bouncing between hypomania and depression, but never really meeting full criteria for any of the full episodes. In terms of causes, we've got a variety of things going on here. Genetically, the bipolar disorders are going to be more based in genes than depression. So there's a 10 times increased risk of developing a bipolar disorder for relatives of someone with a bipolar disorder. And the bipolar disorders likely share a genetic origin with schizophrenia, which is why we might see those psychotic features. Depression only has a 2 to 4 times increased risk for relatives. So still a genetic component, but not nearly as genetically based as the bipolar disorders. As far as environments go, the bipolar disorders may be impacted by significant forms of stress. So we may see them somewhat more likely among folks who have been divorced or widowed. We're also more likely to see the bipolar disorders among high income individuals. Depression is more likely to be associated with adverse childhood experiences. Personality-wise, neuroticism accounts for a substantial portion of the genetic risk for depression, and we may see personality play more of a role in younger forms of chronic depression, as I mentioned earlier. Neurologically, there are several different pathways in the brain that have been implicated with these diagnoses, specifically the dopamine and serotonin pathways. So if you're interested more in kind of neuropsychology, there's some information for you there, but I'm ultimately not going to harp too much, really at all, on anatomy, physiology, or the chemical pathways in this class, but that information's more there if you're interested. We also have cognitive and behavioral explanations for these diagnoses as well. Behaviorally, one explanation for the bipolar disorders is that they are circadian rhythm disorders, meaning that these are individuals who are more sensitive to disruptions with respect to their circadian rhythm. Circadian rhythm being our 24-hour clock that is based primarily in our exposure to light versus darkness. And for most folks, you know, they can do activities at various times of the day or get up or go to bed at different times of the day, and they might feel groggy or out of it, but that they're ultimately fine. But the theory behind the bipolar disorders as circadian rhythm disorders is that this may be a group of people for whom those deviations are very disruptive and can encourage manic, hypomanic, or depressive episodes. So if you, and this is the approach that I use for the bipolar disorder. So when I treat them, regular routine is critical, particularly the time that the person gets up and goes to bed, as well as their exposure to light. I also like to encourage consistency with respect to other activities as well, including meal times, exercise times, things like that. I also like to encourage people to engage in more stimulating mornings and restful evenings, meaning that like when we get up, that's a good time to exercise, get outside, get exposure to light. That's a good time to do more energizing types of things, socialize, work, homework, etc. And then in the evening, around the time that the sun naturally goes down, this is really the best time for more restful activities. Like reading, relaxing at home versus going out. We also want to be cognizant of light exposure because a lot of restful activities these days do involve technology and light coming from a screen. So sometimes I'll even prescribe blue light filter screens or lenses so that people can continue to watch a movie or something like that without continuing to expose themselves to light late into the evening. And then finally, I might also encourage sleep hygiene, which is a series of recommendations to help promote healthy sleep naturally. Yeah, so in a nutshell, that's kind of one of the behavioral explanations for bipolar disorder and some of the behavioral approaches you might take based on that conceptualization. CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, has the strongest empirical support for the treatment of depression. There are some modern approaches like interpersonal therapy or acceptance and commitment therapy that are also effective. I use those approaches as well, and always like to point out that one of the reasons, in addition to being good, that CBT has some of the strongest empirical support is because it's the oldest. Some of the newer approaches haven't gathered quite the amount of support yet, just because of their age. Combining medication and psychotherapy provides only moderate benefits over either treatment alone. And ultimately, CBT may be less efficacious than medication in people severely depressed. So typically one or the other is sufficient. You can combine, but typically you get less return on investment when you combine approaches. And really the only time that either medication or therapy is indicated over the other is in the case of severely depressed individuals, in which case medication may be more efficacious than therapy. About 60% of folks respond to therapeutic interventions, which is a pretty high number. Relapse may occur, therefore it's critical to encourage maintenance therapy and treatment as well. As far as the cognitive behavioral explanations of depression, cognitively, depression is thought of as maladaptive thought processes that don't represent reality. So going back to the cognitive explanation that we discussed at the very beginning of the semester, and that illogical thoughts not based in reality prompt inappropriate, unhealthy, negative emotions. So it's okay to feel negative emotions. We just want them to be healthy, negative emotions that are based in reality versus ones that are warped and based on thought distortions. Behaviorally, depression can cause isolation, and isolation kind of acts on mood as well, cutting people off from things that are positively reinforcing. Meaning that when we're depressed, we're likely to isolate and spend time by ourselves and not do anything. And when we're isolating and not doing anything, we're not doing anything fun, which is going to make us feel better. So it's kind of this vicious cycle between depression and isolation, is the behavioral explanation for depression. And I'm not going to demonstrate anything, but instead you guys should just kind of be able to surmise the cognitive and behavioral explanations for depression. And again, this is really based on what we talked about going way back to chapter 1. Okay, so that's all that I have for y'all. Thanks for tuning in.